we're going to turn this morning to Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and continue the second talk in our series, Under the Sun, Wisdom for Life's Journey. And we were seeing last week that the book of Ecclesiastes, although some people think it's really depressing. In fact, somebody greeted me at the door last week and they go, "Oh, I'm really not looking forward to this season. And this is going to be such a depressing series of sermons." And feeling encouraged. And they came to me this morning and said, "Hey, after last week, I'm re-looking at Ecclesiastes because this book is designed to recalibrate our perspective. It's designed to help us to look at things differently." And you'll know I showed you this image last week. How many people now see a rabbit this week? How many see the duck? And I'm sure some psychologists will tell you that says something about your personality or something. But you know, there are different ways of looking at things. And so much of our life is about having wrong perspective. Just getting so preoccupied with something and it building into something that it really shouldn't be, but it becomes in our life because our perspective is wrong. And the ability to recalibrate our perspective on things is such a vital skill. The university, not university, but it's exam time. We always choose, I've never worked this out, why in the middle of the summer we choose to sit our exams. You know, it's always sunny. Why don't we do it in January when it's horrible outside? But it probably explains Scottish academic achievement. And but you know, you can maybe remember sitting exams where you think your life will be over if you fail that exam. And the opposite of that, your life will be a success if you achieve in that exam. And that becoming such an obsession. And yet actually, most of us who are a bit older know, you know what, it's good to get your exams, but hey, it's not the end of life. And a perspective, and suddenly you have a different perspective on things. And this wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, is designed to train us to do this. It's designed to help us to get better perspective on things. It's part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. This is the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And they explore rules for living. Proverb provides all this very straightforward stuff. You know, work hard and you'll be a success. That's kind of a proverb type thing to say. And then Ecclesiastes come along and says, you know what, it doesn't always work that way. You can work hard and life might not work out for you. You can do all the right stuff. And so Ecclesiastes wants to go a bit deeper and explore all the ambivalence in our life and the incongruities in our life. And ask the question, so what's it all about? And essentially, Ecclesiastes says, under the sun, so it means in this world, what we build our lives on, if we build it on the stuff that is here around us, we will discover it is incredibly transitory. It evaporates. And that word is sometimes translated meaningless or vanity. But the word is actually, it's the idea of smoke. It's the word that's used for smoke. It's this idea of vacuous. I was using the analogy of candy floss, where you see something that looks amazing and you take a bite of it, and it's like, where did that go? Most of it over your face. But it's like it's just disappeared. And it's vacuous or chasing bubbles in the back garden. And some of you may not have done that for a wee while. But you know, you run after the bubble thinking you can capture it. And it just pops. It evaporates. And Ecclesiastes is saying there is so much like that of life that is like that, where we begin to pursue this stuff. And it is ultimately vacuous. It doesn't deliver what we think it promises to deliver. And so Ecclesiastes is asking us to get an appropriate perspective on life. And the teacher, as he's called, Kuela, he turns to the question of money and achievement in Ecclesiastes 5. You know, we live in a world, can I go to the next slide? We live in a world that's obsessed with more money, more possessions, more recognition. You know, many of us have very interesting relationships to money. And it's partly to do with the models that maybe we grew up with and our experiences growing up. I was very fortunate in that, you know, I had reasonably good models in terms of money, and, you know, learn how to earn some, learn how to spend some. I enjoy that bit. Learn how to save some. And learn how to give it away. And if you have children or grandchildren, good lessons to teach your kids as they grow up and model a healthy relationship to money. But for many of us, money is associated with security, and it makes us feel secure. So for some of us, it's very much tied up with our identity, who we are, and money makes us and gives us a sense of worth. It's also sometimes tied up with power and control in a more unhealthy way. My friend's stepfather just died, and we were sitting chatting the other day, exploring the relationship that he had with his stepfather, and it was fascinating because his stepfather had disinherited him. And it wasn't anything to do with money. It was all to do with power and control, and actually about this relationship and the way that he wanted to try and control that relationship. And I'm sure some of us may have experienced how people use money in those terms. Again, a lot of very unhealthy relationships that we have with money. And I'm sure you can think of it. And some people have an inability to go and enjoy money and go and, again, because of their upbringing, so they go out for a nice meal and it becomes really miserable because we can't spend all this money. It's not even a matter of affordability. Others just don't know how to budget their money and end up in debt, and that brings its own captivity and challenges. And so money is a very important element within our lives. And the psychology of money is very important. I remember having a conversation a number of years ago with somebody who was just about to get a divorce settlement that was in the millions, and having a conversation with them. And they had a sense that they did not have enough money. And you're going, how do you get through that? How do you recalibrate that perspective? And here, the Ecclesiastes is trying to ask us to explore and look at it. And it makes the point that we chase after, you know, that next promotion, that next gadget, that next experience, convinced that just a little more will finally bring satisfaction. You know, if I just have that car, that house, that career, this salary level, then I will have fulfillment and satisfaction, and I'll feel secure, and I'll feel good about myself. Ecclesiastes suggests that actually that pursuit of wealth to derive these things, and Ecclesiastes isn't saying wealth is a bad thing, but it's saying the actual pursuit, searching for wealth and material stuff to give us those things, to give us our sense of identity, to give us our sense of security, to help us navigate our way in life. That actually wisdom for the journey is found not in more, but in learning the limits of wealth and achievement. Actually understanding that wealth is a good servant, but a bad master. And learning that. And again, for some of us, it's difficult to do that because of the relationship that we've had with money as we've grown up or in our lives. But the teacher says we have to learn that enough in many situations, isn't enough. He says this in verse 10, the one who loves money will never be satisfied. What he's saying there is he's saying the pursuit of wealth and security cannot deliver what only God can. I remember Bob Dylan. He went through a phase where he became a Christian and was very committed, and all the songs he was writing were an expression of faith. And I loved, it's my favorite Bob Dylan album. The critics panned it, but I think it's the best thing he ever did. And it's called Saved. And it's just a brilliant album. It's a great album. And he starts with a song called The Satisfied Mind. And he has a line, there's not one rich man in 10 that has a satisfied mind. And, you know, I don't know if that's true or not. Sure, it's not scientific, but certainly he would be in the circles where he would know that. Where he would know in terms of wealth and prosperity and what it is like. You see, there's a kind of addictive quality to money. And the more you have, the more you want. See, and the Ecclesiastes begins to reflect on what actually happens when we begin to develop this relationship to money. And what it says is that we find ourselves living in the future in a way that robs us of the present. Living in the future in a way that robs us of the present. And what he wants to do is help us learn to recalibrate that relationship. You know, the first thing he observes is that wealth invites complications. You know, I always think it's hard. You know, if you have lots of money to find a meaningful relationship in your life. And you think, how's that? and the reason it's hard is because you never know. Is the person interested in me or are they interested in my wealth? I've never had this problem, so it's good. but you know, it's a true issue. And the psalmist explains, and he says, you know, that as we attract, we find that when sometimes one prosperity increase, those who consume it also increase. So what does its owner gain except that he gets to see it with his eyes? He says, you know, the pursuit of more and the accumulation of wealth doesn't lead to joy, but often to frustration, to dependence, to responsibilities, and to anxieties. The owner's enjoyment is reduced to mere observation and not true participation. I had a friend, and I think he wasn't even 40. Can't remember. We were young. And he sold his company for £7 million to a man whose net worth was in excess of £100 million. And he sat down, and as I say, he was relatively young, and he had a conversation with this multimillionaire, and they began to chat, and he said, you know, it must be amazing having £100 million. And he said, no, it's horrible. And he goes, what do you mean it's horrible? He says, I worry so much about losing it, about making that bad choice, about making that bad. And he says, I am bound up with that anxiety constantly. And my friend, it kind of recalibrated how he looked at money thereafter. It was a good thing. I also remembered that just after he'd done the deal, so I was a very poor minister, emphasized very poor, we went out for dinner, and he just sold a company for $7 million. And we went Dutch on the meal. I'm like, that explains why he's got $7 million and I haven't. Anyway. And you see, wealth attracts complications, and the teacher goes on to talk about the anxiety that comes with it. You see, he says, the more maybe we know this feeling. You know, you lie awake at night, not because you lack, but because you're worried about keeping what you've gained. The more you achieve, the more you have to lose. The abundance we seek begins to deprive us of rest. Because everything that we are, our identity, our security, is tied up with material prosperity. And we're kind of facing challenges in relation to this. Well, one of the fascinating dynamics in our society that's kind of playing out at the moment is that the boomer generation, of which I'm just the end of, they've estimated that the net worth in the UK of the boomer generation is £7 trillion. Okay? The government are very keen to get some of that, by the way, but 7 trillion is there. The money that the boomers made, who are predominantly now retired, was greater than the money earned by those 24 to 40. They paid more tax than the people 25 or to 40 in our society. I think last year that was. That's a serious problem. It's also reflected in the way that that generation that's coming up is going to relate in relation to money. And at the moment it's creating haves and have-nots. I believe over half of the people that bought houses, it was the parents that enabled them to do that. And so there's this fascinating correlation of how is money being used. And there's also a sense of a sort of, what's the point of trying to achieve? What's the point of aspiring? And so the boomer generation had that mentality. Generations that are coming up don't necessarily share that same mentality, and maybe they have some insights that we don't. But it's going to create some very interesting issues. And the question is, how do we get to a perspective that is a balanced and right perspective? The teacher says, it starts with going to the point of death. And again, this maybe isn't the cheeriest things. But he points out that death is the great leveler. Verse 15. We bring nothing into the world and we take nothing out. And he's saying, you know, it doesn't matter if you have a lot or you have vast amounts. The fact is, when you die, it is a level playing field. And so what he's asking us, he's asking us to think about that fact. To think about the fact that wealth and material things do not go beyond death. Jesus in his teaching, in the letter in Luke's gospel, it's reckoned that 20% of Jesus' teaching is all about wealth. And what Jesus says is, he says, if you think about it, you are building up stuff that is on earth, but the earthly stuff is temporal. And so your perspective has to be, when you look at your life, is what are we doing that will last beyond our life? And he's encouraging us, I think, to build legacy in this world, but he's also encouraging us to build legacy in the next. Because the type of person that you are will be determined not by your money, not by your wealth, but who you are and what you've done. You know, and sometimes when it comes to money, people behave deplorably. And again, it's related to that security, power, all the other things I've talked about. But we're going to have to stand before God in terms of who we are. And so the teacher says, you have to ask the question, is the way that I'm using my money reflective of something that when I stand before God and he says, how have you used the resource that you were to steward? I can say, well, I used it to make the world a better place. I used it to actually shape a legacy. I used it to build some kind of eternal legacy. And this is where we have to ask ourselves, are we spending our lives on something that won't last? And here's the thing for the boomer generation. And again, understand the Bible is not anti-wealth, it's not anti-enjoying yourself, it's not anti-having nice cars or holidays or any of that. I don't believe the Bible communicates that. But what it does say is, if that is all you are doing with your life, it has become a narcissistic, experience-filled life that's all about, I'm living for the moment and now, and it's great. I'm spending my kids' inheritance. And you know what? The teacher said it's a vacuous existence, and if you don't realize it in this life, you will when you die naked and you stand before God. How vacuous what you're doing. And so he says you have to start with the perspective of the eternal. To ask yourself, what are you doing in terms of your life? And what are you doing with your resources in relation to that eternal perspective? To that point of building legacy. Do you know, and the reality is that some of the best stuff in the world actually isn't about money. Yesterday afternoon, I went to the beach with my granddaughter. And we bought her a wetsuit. And so the minute she sees the water, she takes off, boom, straight into the sea. It's great. And I went down, and we sat there jumping waves for half an hour. You know, and it's like the stupidest thing ever. Okay, you know, what's the point? I mean, it's like, really, there's another way. Let's jump it. Okay, I mean, do that for half an hour, you know. Eventually, I'm having to drag her out of the water. But do you know what? You could have offered me £50,000. I wouldn't have exchanged that experience for £50,000. And actually, that's about legacy. You see, that's about building something that lasts. That's about building a memory and an experience. That's about... And what the psalmist is saying is, the teacher is saying, he's saying, you have to think about your life in these terms, in terms of what you're building. You know, achievement is good, but when it becomes your identity, when it becomes your idol, when it becomes what you are living for, then actually it becomes vacuous, it becomes vanity, it becomes empty. And here's the thing, and this is the profound thing that the teacher is saying. He's saying, set your mind on eternity. And then he says, and then come back and live in the present. And it's a fascinating dynamic. I've quoted my Nana many times, but she used to have a favorite phrase. She used to say, you know that phrase that says, the person is too heavenly minded to be of any earthly use? She says that's nonsense. She said the only people who are of earthly use are those who are heavenly minded. And she's right, because that's what the teacher is saying here. He's saying get your perspective right in terms of eternity and what you're building and the legacy that you are leaving. And then he says, now come back. And this is let's go to the next slide. And then he says, now come back to the now. And experience the gift of contentment. He says, because this is the lesson that I've learned. Here's the key. Enjoyment is a gift. Wealth is not the same as the power to enjoy. You can have much and enjoy little, or have little and enjoy much. Just thinking about jumping waves. You see, and what he's saying is, he's saying once you have that light of perspective in terms of your death and eternity, then you come back to the present and you say, now, I want to enjoy this life as a gift. You know, each day, each meal, each moment as a moment of joy, as a gift from God. There was a book, I've forgotten the name, but it had a very simple thesis, that actually life and satisfaction and the sense of joy in life was found in enjoying the little things. You know, buying that really good cup of coffee and sitting there and enjoying that cup of coffee with a friend. And in that moment, not thinking about all the pressures and everything that you've created in your life, but just that moment of enjoying that, of finding the joy in the stuff that you have. Maybe it can be a really nice meal. Maybe it can be a really nice holiday. But, you know, so many of us, and again, as a sort of semi-workaholic, there may be some others in the congregation like this, you know, I think of the many experiences in life where I was way too preoccupied when I should have been there in the moment, enjoying time with my family or doing stuff. But I was worrying or thinking about the next thing or what has to be done or, that book that I'll never write or just, and always not present. And so what the teacher is saying is he's saying once you get this sense of eternity and that you build your life from eternity back, then you come into this life and you are present. You live and enjoy the moments that God gives you. You see, contentment is not found in what you have, but in knowing who gives it. Knowing that each moment and each day is just precious. I was talking to some close friends today, or during the week, and they had just buried their daughter. And they had been given 10 days' notice from diagnosis to death in terms of their daughter. 10 days. The daughter was younger than me. And you just go, wow. And you think, if that was me, and I look at it and I look at all the stuff, all the things, none of it can save you. And then I ask the question, what are the moments? What's the stuff that I've built? What's the stuff that's built that legacy? What's the stuff where I've just enjoyed the moments that God's given me? You see, the key to understanding life is to understand that every day is a gift. Every moment is a gift. And that actually when we use those gifts in the light of that legacy in eternity, we find meaning and joy. And that's what he's saying. He's saying it's a gift to enjoy your life without being consumed by it. That's the gift. And so the teacher is encouraging us to develop this perspective. Let's go to the next slide. So what's the message? Well, the teacher is saying in a world that shouts more, 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 Ecclesiastes whispers, enough. Enough striving, enough chasing, enough believing the lie that the next thing will finally satisfy. It says recognize eternity and the reality of your death, and that you will take nothing, that you came in with nothing and you will take nothing out. And then come back into your life and find the joy in that life, understanding that it is a gift from God. Every breath that we take. The teacher isn't saying wealth is evil. He's saying it's limited. It can't bear the weight of your soul. It can't give your life meaning or your heart peace. But coming back to that place will. So what? Let's go to the last slide. Well, Ecclesiastes is asking us really, I think, to do three things. It's asking us to recognize the limits of wealth and achievement. As I said, they are good servants, but poor masters. It's good to achieve. And just that younger generation, your achievement is good. It's good to work hard. Ecclesiastes is saying it's good to work hard. You will find a joy in it if you don't make it everything. But recognize it's limited. It's limited. It's only when you recognize the eternity and come back into the present that you will find the joy. Secondly, it's saying receive. Receive daily blessings with gratitude. True contentment is found in recognizing each day, each meal, each moment of joy as a gift from God. As you sit down, if you sit down with your family or your spouse or some friends, recognize this is a gift from God. How are we going to use that gift? How are we going to use that moment? How are we going to express that? And you know what? Those gifts don't necessarily cost a lot of money. Maybe it's the way I was brought up, but whenever I go to visit a city, I always find out what's free. And maybe being Scottish. And you know what? Like the churches and things like that. And often in the cities, I derive a lot more pleasure from the stuff that's free than the stuff that costs the earth. Just the joy of a walk by a river, or the joy of a beautiful cathedral that's free to go into, or so much. And it's like that in life. Just receive it and then hold. Hold possessions lightly and steward them faithfully. We're called to use what we have for God's glory. And it's a really important question. And again, I come back, if you're that boomer generation. I think that generation, and it's my generation, we have a real responsibility in terms of how we steward the resources that God has left us. And I think that's important in relation to church. It's important in relation to our families. It's important to relation to what's going to happen in the future. My personal thing is, I don't necessarily think we help subsequent generations by just giving everything to them, and that we need wisdom about how we use that. We need wisdom that we don't become too narcissistic in the way that we choose to live. We need wisdom about how we sustain the work of God in Scotland as it goes forward, and what that looks like, and how we use our resources in relation to that. My prayer is that all of us will have that correct perspective, a perspective that looks to eternity, to the legacy that we're building, and then comes and enjoys the moment, enjoys that meal, dare I say, enjoys that nice drink, enjoys that nice moment with friends, but recognizes God's gifted us this, not just for today, but for tomorrow. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you that our lives are gifts. I thank you that ultimately we find meaning and satisfaction and significance in relation to you, in relation to our God and all that you give us. And Lord, help us to understand that all that we have is ultimately derived from you, and it's a gift to be stewarded. Lord, help us steward these things effectively. Help us not to build our identity, our security. Help us not to get so entangled with possessions that we lose perspective. God, help us to understand that you are the God who provides, that you are the God who sustains, and that you are the God to whom we are indebted in every aspect of life. Lord, fill our lives with those moments that bring joy, that help us discover the true meaning of what it is to enjoy creation and all that you have given us in the light of eternity. Lord, we ask this in your name. Amen.